Hi, my name is Aaron Duran, and I will be covering the Zoot Suit riots that happened in Los Angeles during the 1940s. So, what are Zoot Suiters? Well, specifically, Zoot Suits were long, exaggerated jackets with padded shoulders and high-waisted tapered pants. They were a certain style of clothing that really became popular in the 1930s in the East Coast due to African Americans just wearing them and really bringing in that culture. Then jazz musicians spread the culture throughout America in the 1940s. The culture ultimately landed in the West Coast, specifically Los Angeles, as young Latino Americans and other minorities took on the zoot suits as their own clothing identity. Not really as a social stance or movement or a political gesture, but strictly as their own social and cultural identity of who they identified as and who they represented. Now, a little bit of history of the Mexican American community in Los Angeles. Throughout the 1920s through the 1940s, many Mexicans came to the United States due to job and income opportunities and just a better lifestyle. This is following World War I, and a lot of programs such as the Bracero program were starting to come alive, and a lot of Mexicans needed better jobs, more money to support their families. So they came to the United States and settled in places such as Arizona, California, and primarily Los Angeles. By 1930, the total population of LA was around 2.2 million. Around 1.9 million were whites, and only about 167,000 were Mexicans, most of which became Mexican Americans as they got their citizenship. However, the increased Latino population in LA brought a lot of unrest to white residents and officers. There was a lot of underlying racial tension, and just hatred towards other minorities and different people of color at the time. And during the 1940s, the Mexican community in LA grew really tired and frustrated due to the discrimination in housing, education, employment, and services. As you can see from the picture here on this slide, it serves whites only, and there was a lot of discrimination between not only Mexicans and Latinos, but also other African Americans and Japanese Americans and other people of color as well. Moving forward, this increased racial tension with World War II. So, as mentioned earlier, a lot of Mexican Americans and other minorities took on the Zoot Suit appearance. However, many of the white citizens and officers thought it to be a gang. Although not gang related, they didn't think of themselves as a gang or as a social stance or movement, but they did think of themselves as having that identity, and therefore a lot of white residents became fearful, aggravated, and agitated towards the Mexicans who wore zoot suits and gave them the term zoot suiters. During World War II, this amplified as a lot of white servicemen and citizens thought zoot suiters were dodging the military responsibilities of the draft and serving in their army, which is very untrue. A lot of Mexican Americans did fight in World War II, um, and it did bring a lot of attention back at home. Although the military and the army were very segregated, they have their own branches, um, segregated by race. And with World War II brought a lot of changes in the social dynamic. As white men fought in segregated militaries, minorities filled their jobs back at home. This also kickstarted the purification, if you will, in Los Angeles of minorities. This is seen primarily and at first with Japanese Americans, as they were put in internment camps. Different laws were formed to prevent them from uh, gaining their full life back. And this eventually trickled down to African Americans, and here basically with Mexican Americans in Los Angeles. Now, this brings us to around 1943 when a lot of the riots began to break out. A little bit of backstory: throughout 1942, a lot of anger and hatred towards young Mexican Americans began to build up and grow. This was due to some of actual gang violence between Mexicans and Mexicans in LA, or also Mexicans and other white people at the time. But as the hatred grew, the racial tension as the foundation in America at the time just began to be exposed. And it basically boiled over on May 30th in 1943, where the first riots broke out in downtown LA. Around 11 U.S. sailors who came back home actually got into a physical altercation with a lot of Zoot suiters. They instigated it. However, they returned to the police and said they were jumped by the Zoot suiters, and later that night, police came to clean up and finish off the Zoot Suiters. Around 200 in total of returned military servicemen, white citizens, and off-duty police officers swept the streets of LA looking for Zoot Suiters, hunting down minorities, people of color, people in these clothings, to really just get out violence, and all due to racial tension and unrest. Around June 3rd is when the main Zoot riots began to break out, and this lasted throughout June. Mainly the main riots were June 3rd through June 8th. So what's the aftermath? Around 150 Zoot shooters were injured, over 500 young Latino Americans and other minorities were arrested, and the media really framed the Zoot Suit riots to be instigated by quote unquote Zoot Suit gangs, as the article in this slide says and shows. The media really pushed to frame it as Mexicans instigating, as non-whites being the aggressors. However, this is very untrue. As you can see, based on the numbers in the previous slide, around 200 were mobbing the streets, and the majority of the people arrested were Mexican descent. The U.S. government really viewed the riots as embarrassing during the time of war, a time where people were supposed to come together and band and be united in the same country. The war actually exposed a lot of racial tension and discrimination and really just conflict between ourselves, which was really embarrassing. It was really shameful. And although Zoot Suiters weren't a social justice movement such as the Black Panther Party, a political movement like others, fighting for specific social change, they did help exploit social issues of racism and discrimination in America. Um, Zoot Suiters served as an example to change social stigmas at the time around race in the United States. Although they faced a lot of violence, they faced a lot of backlash. What they stood for was identity. What they stood for was finding one's own personal identity and culture in America, and how we could all hopefully get along and find our own style and be ourselves. Therefore, they are thought of a social movement that fought against racism. Thank you for listening to my slides on the Zoot Suit riots. I hope you learned something, and thank you again.